This episode is brought to you by Oberle Risk Strategies, the insurance brokerage and insurance diligence provider that's been trusted by investors, lenders, searchers, and CEOs for over a decade now. The company is led by August Felker, himself a two-time searcher within both the funded and the self-funded models. He personally runs Oberle's dedicated search fund practice that works with searchers across the entire diligence, purchase, and post-close process. Their diligence offering, which is completely free, by the way, will assess your target company's insurance program and will summarize any potential coverage gaps, the pro forma insurance pricing, and any changes needed for closing or shortly thereafter. In 9 out of every 10 client engagements, they're able to either reduce spend or improve coverage, all in such a way that the searcher or CEO can focus on other things while Oberle handles all things insurance for them. Oberle has serviced over 900 customers across a decade of operation and has an NPS score that puts them at the very top of their industry. But don't take my word for it. Click on the hyperlink located within today's episode description, and we will gladly put you in touch with as many happy Oberle customers as you'd like. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of In the Trenches. I am your host, as always, Steve DeVitkos. So I'm guessing that the CEOs in our audience are likely to agree with me when I say that crafting a truly effective incentive compensation plan is simultaneously one of the most difficult and one of the most important tasks that a small business CEO will face. Let's start with important. Charlie Munger is famous for saying, quote, "Never, ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives," unquote. He also went on to say, quote, "I think I've been in the top 5% of my age cohort all my life in understanding the power of incentives, and all of my life I've underestimated them," unquote. So if we can agree that structuring the right incentives are important, why does doing so tend to be so difficult? I mean, how hard can it possibly be to write up a decent incentive program? Well, probably harder than you think. Based on many years of experience putting them together myself, here are just a few of the challenges that I encountered. First, avoiding unintended consequences and people gaming the system. Second, how to balance individual goals versus company goals versus departmental goals. Third, how to incent people on company goals when the achievement of those goals falls largely outside of their control. Fourth, if or how to change a comp plan if circumstances change materially within any given year. Fifth, how to manage changes in goals and targets across any 2 given years. Sixth, the balance between simplicity and detail. This one was a particularly hard one for me. And seventh, which is particularly relevant to acquisition entrepreneurship, how to handle inherited employees whose salaries may fall outside of company-wide pay bands. Oh boy, if only the important things were all so easy. Well, to help me untangle each of these challenges, as well as a few others that I haven't yet mentioned, I was joined this week by Stacey Carroll. Stacey has spent substantially her entire career leading HR organizations across a wide array of companies and industries with a specific focus on compensation and benefits. She has also spent the past 14 years leading HR Experts on Call, a company that she founded where she acts as an interim HR leader for small and medium-sized businesses. Before we dive into today's episode, allow me to conclude with my usual reminder that I'm an active investor in search funds and the companies that they acquire through our fund, Mineola Search Partners. So if you're looking to raise a search fund yourself, I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you. But for now, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Stacey Carroll. Stacey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Really excited to have you here. Maybe we can begin by having you just walk us through some of the major stops in your career, and then we can take the discussion from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm one of those people that sort of fell into HR after college. I jokingly say I'm old enough that when I graduated college, I pulled out the want ads, which were still in paper form,
Yep,
and
still a thing.
started looking for jobs. And ended up working for a small TPA firm, helping in a call center, answering questions about 401k plans. And that was my first kind of introduction to HR as a profession. So from there, I kind of just built my career early on. In 1998, I had my first opportunity to work in the compensation space. I joined an organization to specialize in compensation and benefits. And there was a consultant that was doing the comp plan. And so I got to learn from that consultant as I transitioned the work in-house. In 2008, I went to work for a tech startup, which in hindsight was probably bad timing, but it worked out. And the tech company was creating compensation software for businesses. So our clients were small and mid-sized businesses. And I was able to build the customer service function and then later the professional services function. And myself and the small team ended up building over 200 comp plans for small and mid-sized businesses. In 2012, I took all that experience into my own consulting business. I decided I wanted to be an entrepreneur and do this for myself. And I've had that business open since then. I did have an opportunity to go back in-house for a large organization in 2014 and did that until about 2020. Again, right in the benefits and compensation space. But since 2020, I've been working in this consulting business again full time. And had the opportunity to, again, spend some time, especially in the post-COVID era, helping different companies figure out how to wrestle with compensation. I think a lot changed for people post-COVID. And I think compensation was a big piece of it. And so it's been very interesting, even having done this work for going on 30 years, to see how much is changing and evolving since 2020.
Before we hit record, I was telling you that I designed a comp plan over 7 years for one company. And by virtue of your experience having designed comp plans for 200 companies, I said that you're 199 ahead of me. So I'm excited to learn from all of your experiences today and to learn about comp plans. I mean, a lot of our discussion is going to be about monetary aspects of comp plans, but I am interested in talking to you a little bit about the non-monetary aspect, but we'll get there. Maybe let's
Yes.
start with like Incentive Comp 101.
Yep.
Can you share with us what
Mhm.
you think the hallmarks of a great incentive comp system are? Like, what do all of the best plans seem to have in common with each other?
Yeah. And I want to for just 1 minute clarify that a lot of these questions, and we can dive into it a little bit more, but a lot of these questions I'm going to answer from the perspective of an incentive plan, which in my world is a little different than sales comp plans.
Right.
And the way I differentiate is sales comp are usually those people that are 100% commission based, or vast majority of their, comp is incentive based. And so when I answer this question, I'm thinking about the incentive plans where people have a salary and maybe the incentive plan is kind of a layer on top of that.
Yes.
I think the number one rule, and you probably won't be surprised just from the nature of your questions, I know that you're already anticipating this, is these plans need to be simple.
Yeah.
And that is one of the great hallmarks of a good incentive plan. It's simple. I also think they need to be based on clear, objective criteria. And on my preference in working with a company is that the metrics are things that are already tracked in the business. In other words, we're not creating a new set of workload for ourselves to create metrics and design systems to track those and get overly complex because then you get lost in the weeds. So EBITDA is a great metric because we're already tracking that. We're already looking at that. It's very objective, and most people understand it or can understand it with the right education.
Yeah.
And then I think a really important thing, believe it or not, outside of the nuts and bolts, is communication. A lot of times you'll see organizations create these incentive plans, spend a lot of time and effort, maybe even bring in a consultant to do it, and they roll it out. And then it's just not talked about till the end of the year when we go to measure it again. And I think that that can be a real failure of a plan. So I think the communication strategy around an incentive plan is important. And the fourth point and last point, and it's kind of related to the communication, it's got to mean something to everyone in the org. And by that, I mean, everyone feels like they know why this is an important metric and how it relates to them. And again, I think that's a clear part of the communication plan. So I don't know if that surprises you that I would focus so much on the latter 2 points, even though when we talk about incentive plan, a lot of people think about how to design them, right?
So much of our conversation today is going to focus around the specific issues and problems and roadblocks that I faced when I put incentive plans together.
Yeah.
And you actually already mentioned one that I forgot to put into my questions,
Yeah.
which is this concept of control. And that the idea was sparked in my mind when you said EBITDA.
Hmm.
Hey, not everyone necessarily understands that, but with enough explanation, people reasonably can understand that.
Right.
My issue that I kept running into when I attempted to bake EBITDA into our incentive comp plans is this issue of control, which is to
Yeah.
say, frontline employees, maybe they have some control over revenue, but
Yeah.
they arguably don't have much control over cost. I could theoretically decide
Mhm.
to hire a bunch of people and make a bunch of
Yep.
bad hires. I
Yep.
could decide to open a new unprofitable branch. As a
Yeah.
CEO, I could decide to do a whole bunch of stuff
Yeah.
totally outside of their control that
Yep.
negatively impacts EBITDA.
Hmm.
I'd just love to hear you just riff on that idea specific
Yeah.
to the concept of control.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point because I hear that a lot is, oh, incentive plans, employees need to feel in control. I agree with that to some degree, but I also agree there is a way to help people to understand how they contribute to that outcome. And I'll share a story with you. So I worked for a large airline and based in Hawaii. And the CEO, believe it or not, that airline did not have the best on-time performance. And it was sort of a joke because it's like you have no weather delays. How can you not be the
Yeah.
best performing on-time airline? And so the CEO came in and he made it his mission to make the primary goal of the organization on time, performance. So you think about it, how could a person sitting in HR in the corporate headquarters really affect on time performance? And the reality is, we did a lot of things to contribute to that, whether it was hiring, managing absence management and leaves, helping to design workforce plans that anticipated staffing needs around seasonality. The reality is if we allow people to say, well, I don't have much control over that, we're missing an opportunity to help people to understand at the end of the day, we're here for a reason. And whether that's a for-profit reason or whether that's some other reason, we just need to help employees to understand how what I do every day links to that goal.
Mm.
And if we can't create that, that vision for employee, I think that's a failure on our management side rather than letting people take us down the path of, well, everyone else makes decisions that affects that. Of course. But in an organization, if we are focused, we can find our place in those goals, even if somebody else is making a decision that is contributing to that goal as well. Does that make sense?
It does. And I wonder if you were to zoom out from those incentive plans that you helped design for those 200
Yep.
companies, are there any like particularly common traps or mistakes or
Yeah.
unintended consequences that you see in these plans that are designed by like otherwise well-intended leaders?
Yes, absolutely. The first goes to the antithesis of the first hallmark, which is they're overly complex.
Right.
And I think it's just natural. Um, I think it's like the idea of, well, if I measure this, then it might, if I measure productivity, then safety will fail. Or if I measure this. And so everyone tries to build into those plans so many layers of complexity. Or, the famous balanced scorecard. We can't overly rely on financial metrics. We got to think about our customers. And we got to think about our employees. Again, I get it. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, what happens is we end up with a program that is not simple. And when it's not simple, it's harder to understand and it's harder to track. And then it's harder for employees to be able to understand where are we against those goals. So that's the number one trap. And there's lots of ways to mitigate that so that those other issues don't happen. But I would say that that's the most common thing I see is overly complex plans.
And I would imagine that that impairs like the motivational
Totally.
qualities, right? If it's too complex, it's probably
Yep.
not going to motivate people in the ways that you would otherwise intend it to.
Exactly. And it kind of brings me to my second point that I see as a common mistake, which is oftentimes incentive plans go too far down in the org. And it's this idea that, oh, I want everyone to be involved in this incentive plan. But the reality is if you're bringing that plan deep into the org, then just by the math of what's appropriate, the amount of incentive compensation on the table is so small that then when you start carving it up into these little pieces, sometimes employees will say, you know what, that's way too complex to figure out for 500, 600, $1,000. So
Yeah.
I'm just gonna wait and see what happens at the end of the year and how much my incentive comp is.
Actually, you know what? That reminds me of an issue that I faced. So I remember putting an incentive in place for a particular group in
Yeah,
my organization. And this particular group was like reasonably well compensated.
yeah,
And I remember a couple months after we put it into place, it wasn't at all having its desired effects. And I remember
yeah,
saying to a CEO friend of mine, we put in this incentive plan, we did all these things, and it's not working. And I
mhm,
remember he stopped me cold in my tracks when he asked me, well, how much money would they make if they hit the goal? Right. And
yeah,
I said, oh, it's X dollars. He said, well, how much is X dollars compared to the average annual salary? And I don't
yeah.
remember what the percent was,
Yep.
but it was reasonably low. And he said, well, there's your problem. Yeah, the dollar amount in question is simply not big enough to get anybody out of bed. Do you see that as like another through line of mistakes that you
Absolutely.
see?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it goes back to your point too about let's pretend you had, 4 or 5 metrics you were tracking for any one plan. And then, let's say the dollar amount on the table, even if it was $5,000, but then you start dividing that up amongst these metrics. Very soon and very quickly, employers are going to figure out, oh, well, this is a metric that's pretty attainable. I'll focus there and get that, piece of the pie. But this metric, which again, maybe $1,000, it's going to be really difficult. And I don't really understand it and I don't really know how to get there. So I'm just not going to focus on that. And so this idea as a leader that you've got all these metrics you want people to focus on, and then you put these dollar amounts to them, really quickly there's kind of an ROI calculation done by employees about my level of effort I need to put in and what's the potential payout.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So I'm really excited for the remainder of our conversation because the remainder of our conversation is going to follow a very specific format. We're going to go through, this is slightly self-indulgent, but I assume that other people have these problems as well. At least I
Right.
hope they do. We're going to go through the 7 most meaningful challenges that I faced when trying to design an effective incentive compensation plan within my own company. And for
Yep.
each problem, I'm going to articulate the problem and then give you an actual example from my actual real world experience. And then I'd love to just hear your reaction and we can kind of take it in any direction that it ends up going. So,
Love it.
challenge number 1 is avoiding unintended consequences and people quote unquote gaming the system. So the example from my experience was we had a customer support group and I wanted to comp them on the number of support tickets that they closed, figuring, hey, more closed support tickets equals more happy customers equals better retention metrics. The unintended consequence that I did not foresee, which seems very obvious in hindsight, is they cherry picked the easiest tickets that they could close,
Yep.
close, close, and the long and complex and truly important ones just kind of lingered in the queue. So that
Yep.
was my specific flavor of unintended consequences slash gaming the system. I'd love to just hear your reaction, maybe not necessarily to my specific example, but just to this idea more broadly.
Yep. And it goes back to one of the fundamentals we talk a lot about in incentive design is focus on results, not activities. And it also goes back to something I feel very passionate about, which is, again, when we're tying money to something, let's make sure it's results driven. The behaviors to get to that activity should be about performance management. And that comes back to leadership and management. So in your example, the activity was closing the ticket. But you even in your question, you articulated what you were hoping the result would be, right?
Right.
Customer retention, satisfaction. Those are the things we tie money to. And more importantly, then we teach employees through performance management and effective management how to get those results because we know closing tickets, we know resolving customer issues lead to those things. And we need that to be managed well. But it's not where the incentive dollars go. The incentive dollars go to the results. And so I always tell people really ask yourself when you look at your incentive plan, am I paying for results or am I paying for activity?
Mm.
Because when you pay for activity, employees just naturally will always find the way to make that formula work.
So interesting. I love that framing of focus on the end result, not the activities required to get you to that end result. I've never thought about it like that, but that makes perfect intuitive sense to me.
And salespeople know this, right? It's not the phone call that you want to reward. It's not the
Right.
cold call. It's not all that. It's that we know in our businesses, hopefully, that when we do the cold calls, we know that funnel starts at the beginning. And if you don't do that, then all the other stuff can't happen. Now, within that, we know eventually what'll happen is the really good salespeople will have a higher conversion rate. So that's great. We can manage to that. But it has to start with that beginning of that funnel and teaching people how that works. But the money should be tied ultimately to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, second challenge. This one I
Yep.
remember just agonizing over. I messed this up more times than I care to admit. And this is striking an appropriate balance between individual goals, departmental goals, and company goals. So I actually had two examples came to mind
Mhm.
here. So I don't remember what year this was, but in some particular year, we had a company goal of acquiring X new customers, whatever it was, just make up a number, 100 customers.
Yep.
But our customer support team couldn't directly contribute to that. I mean, I could argue that they could indirectly contribute, but linearly, that didn't seem to be like a direct correlation. A second example was I remember our finance and accounting department had a goal to shorten their collection period from whatever it was, 40 days to 30 days, for example. But again, that was very department specific. It was important for them. It was important enough that I'd be happy to reward them if they attain that goal. But that was very company specific. I couldn't give that to our software engineering team, for example. So, this concept of individual goals versus departmental goals versus company goals.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that creating individual goals can be hard, and it can take a lot of time and effort. So I always encourage organizations to think about those individual goals actually being higher up in the org, which is sort of contrary to popular belief, which is the higher up I am, the more control I have over company-wide results, right?
Hmm.
But I actually think it's opposite. And so creating really good incentive plans with very individual based goals, I think should be reserved for, the highest levels, the C-suite level. And again, we can talk about what the design of those could look like. When it comes to department goals, I think what's really important, and I say this a lot when I talk with organizations, the department goals, I said it depends a lot on your culture. And the reason for this is I've actually worked in organizations at opposite ends of the spectrum, very sort of individually oriented organizations. And to stereotype for a minute, it's a couple of the like tech companies that I've worked for, which have been very heavily focused on results. And those ideas of department related goals sometimes do more damage than good because there's this idea that there's this goal that we're all trying to achieve and wow, I did more than that guy did to contribute to the goal. Why does he get compensated for that?
I see.
I also worked for an organization that worked in a place not only for the company, but the place it was based was very relationship based. And they had individual goals that weren't working because people didn't want necessarily to inconvenience the customer. It was in a banking environment, so it had to do with, that relationship and driving more products, right?
Yeah.
And these were folks that worked in a community where they lived, and they didn't want to necessarily inconvenience, their neighbor by asking them, if they were interested in more products until the goal was department based, because then it was about the branch goal. And all of a sudden, employees were not thinking about their own needs, but they were thinking about helping the team accomplish that branch goal. So the department goals, it's kind of interesting because I always say I need to first know what's the culture of your org because your incentive plan should mirror that. I am a big believer that you're not going to drive culture by incentive plan design, among other
Right.
things. You have to support what's already there. And if you want culture change, that's a different conversation, right? So incentive plan needs to support what's already there in the culture and reinforce that. So I think it's a tough thing, and I hope I'm answering your question, but it goes back to the point, and I'll use one final example. It was many years ago now. I kind of aging myself, but it was groundbreaking news when Netflix came out with the unlimited PTO policy, right? And that
Yeah.
that PowerPoint was, LinkedIn and on the net. It was
Yep.
everybody and their mom wanted to have an unlimited PTO policy. And I used to tell people all the time, listen, that works for Netflix, and that's not going to work here at your company because that doesn't fit.
Right.
So I think when it comes to this question of how much is individual, how much is team, how much is company wide, there's not a perfect formula or script. There's doing what makes sense for your organization and the culture that exists there. And that's why I don't I don't always believe in these plug and play kind of incentive plans. I think the work is much harder than that to design something that fits the org.
Is there an example of like a type of culture where an individual or a departmental goal would make more sense, or maybe like a type of culture where it would make less sense, just so we can dig down a little bit on this idea of, hey, it needs to be aligned with your culture?
Yeah, I think if we think about, the business life cycle, right? When you're in the beginning phases as a business and you're going to live and die, meaning your runway is only 2 years of cash,
Yeah.
then that's kind of a culture that makes sense. The survival of the business is, can we achieve these goals and can
Right.
people help us do it?
Right.
If you think about a more legacy business where our job is to retain customers, retain our market share, do all that, then I think something that's more individual or company based is going to make a lot of sense. And of course, that's a gross oversimplification, but I think it goes back to thinking about the business and what the goals are and what type of people are attracted to that type of business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, challenge number three.
Hmm.
If or how to change a comp plan if things change materially within any
Yeah.
given year. So I have kind of, again, two examples in my experience. One is quite a drastic example, the other less so. So
Mhm.
in March of 2020,
Yeah.
suddenly our 2020 budget was abruptly, basically completely meaningless, completely irrelevant, right? But outside of a once in a generation global pandemic, more broadly, I felt like by the time April rolled around in every year, I felt like our budget was totally out the window because things change internally, things change externally, just stuff happened. And that stuff can impact what the company prioritizes. Like, I remember employees used to be frustrated. Hey, our priority in January was X, but now in June it's Y. And I was like, well, yeah, the company operates in the real world, things change. But that was a constant source of frustration. So there was always this question of, well, should I change the comp plan now that things have changed, either internally or externally?
Yep. The short answer is no. But the longer answer is twice in my career, I've seen the time where that no should be a yes. One was, you know, through 2008 through 2010, and the other
Yeah,
was the global pandemic, right?
right.
Those in my mind are true black swan, out of the control of the company events. Other times, I think what's really important to remember, because leaders would come to me all the time and just be like, wow, we've not been doing as well as we thought, or things shifted. I remind people that that's the reason an incentive plan exists. In a business, you have your fixed cost and your variable cost. Your fixed cost is your salary, and your variable cost is the incentive plan. And if the business is suffering, one of the advantages of an incentive plan is it's a variable cost. It's not
Right.
supposed to pay out. And I think what happens is too often people, because maybe of some of the things we talked about, they start to want to change the structure of that plan to make it more achievable, when in actuality the reason it exists is that it's not supposed to always be achievable.
Right.
And so I really caution people to change things up, because even if it feels out of the control of the employee, because that is the benefit of an incentive plan. Otherwise, I would argue put the money towards base salary.
Interesting.
The second part, though, is let's talk more about when things really, let's say you're tracking on a certain kind of business strategy and that strategy changes. I think is appropriate to revisit the plans. And I think that's really where one thing that I think is a good discipline of a good incentive plan is that there is, a document that not only outlines a plan document that kind of outlines kind of the who, what, when, where, and why, but also that there's, something in writing that describes how the plan is organized, and that you make sure those two documents also leave room for you to make changes should there be a material change in the company. Now, how often that should be done, I would say no more than possibly one change throughout the year. In other words, if you're having to change the metrics of the incentive plan every quarter, then the plan may be too drilled down and too specific. But a once a year kind of reset, if there's been a dramatic strategy change, I think would be appropriate. And again, I would just say make sure your plan documents and how it's described is very open to that readjustment.
This episode is brought to you by Oulay. Now, for those of you who operate within the search fund ecosystem, you probably already know that Oulay is the standard when it comes to quality of earnings reports, tax, and audit services. But for those of you who are newer to the community, consider this. Over the past 20 years, Oulay has worked directly with hundreds of search funds from capital raise to exit, currently assisting over 150 funds in the search phase and another 125 in the operating phase. They work with searchers across the entirety of the ETA journey, from issuing K1s to your investors during the search phase, all the way through to helping prepare your books for an exit at the conclusion of the operating phase. They are the industry leader in performing financial due diligence and creating Q of E reports that your investors can rely on. They provide a full suite of tax services, both for your search fund and for the acquired company. They perform the annual audits required by most debt and equity investors. And they also perform outsourced accounting services, acting as a fractional bookkeeper and controller for those companies whose needs might not necessitate full-time in-house resources. In short, you can safely assume that these guys get it. They've grown up in the search fund ecosystem over the past 20 years, and they have the reputation to prove it. To learn more, go to boulaygroup.com. That's BOULAY group.com. So you just brought to mind another challenge or potentially opportunity that folks listening to this face. And in fact, I faced this very same thing. So when I bought my company, it had been run by the same founder for north of 20 years. It's very typical in this ecosystem.
Yeah.
And very frequently what we see is in December of any given year, that founder gives out bonuses on a totally discretionary basis from
Yeah.
the gut, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Employees don't know how much it's going to be. They don't know how the CEO came up with that number. They
Yeah.
either get it or they don't get it. So I don't want to ask necessarily so much about like why that might be a bad idea,
Yeah.
because I suspect you think that's not necessarily the best comp plan in the world. But the challenge that, or potentially, like, how should new owners think about stepping into a situation like that? Is that a challenge to be overcome? Is that a wonderful opportunity that should make us salivate because we could finally put some structure in a way that employees have been, yearning for? How should a new leader who has, bought their way into that type of situation and who has inherited that comp plan or potentially lack of a comp plan, like, how should they think about a situation like that?
Yeah. You might be surprised to learn that I'm actually a huge fan of discretionary plans. And more on the side of the idea of like a spot bonus program. I think where it can get problematic is if the leader happens to do it every December and people start anticipating it.
Yes.
I think that's where the challenge comes when people don't understand what is it based on, and this person got this and I got that, and you can run into all sorts of problems. But by the very nature of, it's a funny story. When I was, my job in high school was to work at Baskin Robbins, and it was an independently owned franchise. And I remember that the owner of the company, again, I'm aging myself, but we used to get the paper pay stubs, and he
Yep.
actually used to hand write out checks. And I remember that I would come in and get my paycheck stub, and on a very random and unpredictable manner, it would say, this paycheck includes a raise of 25 cents per hour. And sometimes it would be months between it, and sometimes it'd be weeks between the increases. And I remember how good it felt. I mean, sometimes it'd only be 10 cents an hour, but I remember it just felt good. It was not anticipated, it was not expected, and yet it really felt like I earned it, I deserved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm actually kind of a big fan of discretionary spot bonus type programs where it's not expected and it comes when there's been some significant success for the organization and the owner or the CEO wants to share that with employees. But in the example that you gave, I think you're talking about that everyone knows that in December, the quote unquote, turkey is going to come or what's going to happen. And then there's, it gets harder to kind of make employees feel appreciative of that because it starts to feel expected.
Yes.
But I do think that there is some value in using that discretionary spot bonus type program, but making sure that it's always linked back to something within the business performance. We had a really great quarter. We landed a big contract. Make sure that instead of people feeling like, this is really going to sound counterintuitive, but instead of people feeling like it's how well I performed or not, because that could be different for every person in the company, it's instead tied to a significant milestone within the business that the owner or president or CEO wants to celebrate.
Makes sense. Another challenge that I faced is how to make changes in targets across
Yep.
any two given years. And a couple of examples came to mind when I was thinking about this.
Yep.
Sales teams notoriously bemoan the fact that their quotas seem to go up every year, even if
Right.
we haven't released any new products, for example, or
Yep.
things just haven't changed all that much more broadly. I found that it was very easy to give and very hard to take away. So, for example, if you give a person a one-time spiff or like a one-time just kind of incentive or bonus in year one, it's very hard to take it away in year two, even if you said, hey, this is a one-time incentive.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the third example of this kind of challenge in terms of how to change targets or manage the change in targets across any two given years was I remember giving a raise, and I don't exactly remember what the numbers were, but hypothetically, let's say I gave a 6% raise in 2024. That
Right.
probably means that a 4% raise in 2025 might be met with disappointment, even though it's a 4% raise.
Yeah.
So, this challenge of managing changes in targets across any two given years.
Yeah. So I have sat in many a sales kickoff meetings. And, the salespeople are like, it's never going to work. We're never
Yeah,
going to get there. It's kind of like, what is the saying about, is it the 4 minute mile? I'm not a runner.
that's
So
right. The Roger Bannister 4 minute mile.
yeah,
That's right.
yes. Here's the thing I always tell people, especially having spent most of my career doing compensation work. My goal is not satisfaction, because if it was, I'd never feel like I met my goal. My goal is to create plans that are fair and that are well understood by employees, not that they love, because the very nature of this work is that we're not going to make people happy all the time. My goal with working with leaders is to say, I want to make sure your employees are very clear about the goals of the organization and that they feel empowered to achieve those.
Mm.
And I think the big difference with a big, gnarly sales goal is all about leadership. And it's about the leaders that you have that make it feel empowering. And like you, I've seen the power of a big, hairy goal, a big, hairy, audacious goal at the beginning of the year that salespeople think they can't accomplish. And then that first quarter meeting where you start celebrating the successes and talking about, narrowing in on that goal and celebrating the success and doing that. And you see the momentum build. And I've seen it over and over again. And I think, again, one of the greatest compliments someone ever gave me is you're not like most comp people I know, because you talk about culture and you talk about management, you talk about leadership, and that it is the truth. It really is the truth. The incentive plan, the comp plan, those are numbers, but what makes it come alive is everything else. And as a consultant, I often tell people, I can build this plan for you, but it's only going to come alive when your leaders embrace it and they take it as their job to seriously empower people to say, you know what? Maybe this goal is too high. Maybe it's not, we're not going to get there, but boy, we're going to try. And I
Mhm.
think a big part of that trying is regular check-ins and talking about and empowering employees to get there.
That makes sense. This next one, I think I know your answer to, but maybe we can go
Yeah.
into a bit more detail, or we can blow past it, whatever you think would make the most
Yeah.
sense. And that is the what we spoke about at the beginning, which is the balance between simplicity and detail.
Yeah.
I agree that my most effective comp plans were likely my simplest ones,
Yeah.
but I do think this probably falls under the category of like easier said than done,
Right.
because I still felt that I left so much on the table, and there was so much that I felt like I didn't capture in those simple
Yeah.
comp plans that I did capture in my years 1 and 2 comp plans, where it seemed to capture like the greatest number of variables and outcomes that I wanted to encourage. But of course, the price that I had to pay was it was
Yep.
complicated, it was hard to track, it was hard to explain, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
So I got a benefit, but I paid a price. With the simple comp plan, I got a benefit. It was easy to understand. I didn't have to explain it that much. It was easy to track, but I arguably paid a price in that I didn't necessarily incent all of the behaviors that I wanted to incent. So maybe just riff on this idea of simplicity versus detail and this idea that you're probably going to pay a price regardless of which one you choose.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to thinking about, I often talk to people about or leaders about we don't have to pay for every single behavior, right? We can still performance manage what's important and we can still set goals and we can still use non-monetary rewards to celebrate our successes and the things that we want to achieve.
Right.
And so I think it's getting out of the idea that everything we want we have to pay for. Because as we know, and this is cliche to say, but I believe it to my core, is that money is not the only motivator for folks. And so it's still okay to have goals. It's still okay to have things we track, that we don't have a one-to-one relationship between the behavior and the money. And so I think, and again, I hate to keep harping on the same old topic here, but I think it comes down to leadership and management and how much time are we spending with our employees to really have meaningful conversations. I can tell you, and of course, people want to label this as a generational thing, and I don't necessarily think it is. But I think that people want to feel like they matter to their
Yeah.
boss, to their org. And that doesn't always come in the form of money. As a matter of fact, sometimes money takes away from that value. And so I think it's really important that we think about I can still have expectations of performance and I can still have expectations of things I want for my employees to be focused on and doing, but I don't have to have that one-to-one relationship with money.
That reminds me of I mean, God knows how many mistakes I made as a CEO. I can think of like maybe 1 or 2 things that I did right. One of them was, and it goes back to something that you said earlier, which is the value of unexpected, seemingly random rewards. So I remember there was one leader in our company who was clearly red lighting, like he was burning the midnight oil, working a lot, clearly being pulled in a million different directions for quite some period of time. So out of nowhere, I walked into his office and I said, I want you to go home at noon today. You're going to take your wife out to dinner. You're going to stay at the Royal York downtown. And you're going to do dinner and a staycation downtown on me, on the company. Um, Now, I have no idea what that costed. I'll make up a number. Let's say it cost $1,000. I could have just written him a check for $1,000 and said, hey, thanks for all the hard work. Monetarily, those are two identical outcomes, and he could have spent that $1,000 however he pleased. But there was something about here's a gift card, here's a voucher for a hotel, and by the way, this is a total surprise. It almost made him emotional when I did that to him. And again, I could have just written him a check for $1,000, but there is something to this idea of non-monetary rewards, and specifically like the power of a surprise.
Absolutely. Now, first of all, I want to give you credit because just the fact that you think about these things and you worry about these things, even though you're saying, I made a lot of mistakes. I have a feeling that you were a pretty competent leader just based
Well,
on
I
the
worry
things.
about everything. I'm an anxious basket case, but that's something for my therapist to discuss.
Well, I always tell people when leaders worry about things, I actually tell them they're probably a smarter leader than they think.
Oh, good. Well, I must be a genius then.
You are spot on. And even as I was thinking about, these questions and talking about things, I jotted a simple note as well. One of the things I say to people all the time is, if you gave me $100, the equivalent of $100 in your org to solve any people challenges, I would spend 95% of that $100, $95 on frontline managers, because I believe an organization lives and dives by the people who sit in that middle management role and drive the work forward. And I can tell you, of all the middle managers I've worked with, it's very rare that you would find someone that would say, what I really need is, more of an incentive plan. If you told them, I'm actually gonna require you to take a week off, and I'm gonna block and tackle for you to the point where you are gonna turn off your phone and go on that vacation. And I'm gonna take care of everything that comes in, internal and external, while you're on that vacation for a week. I almost guarantee you every middle manager out there would choose that over some different dollar amount.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely, spot on. I was working with an organization and we were trying to come up, it's kind of like in tech when you do the hack days or whatever. Everyone gets in a room and just brainstorms big, like big
Yeah.
TED Talk ideas for a day about what would improve the organization. And in this particular organization, we were talking about, what if we didn't do pay increases, for 7 years? And instead, once every 7 years, you got to take a paid sabbatical with your family, and you could do whatever you wanted, and then come back to work. And almost every employee in that room said, I would choose that over an annual increase, to be able to take a paid sabbatical every 7 years. And while I don't know if that's actually a practical thing to do, that would be kind of difficult, especially for a small business to manage. I think the concept is still there. The concept that if you try and pay for things outside of good management and caring for people and taking care of them, you have to pay a lot more money than just doing those fundamentals.
Yeah.
And so it's, I think, a trap for people to think, one of the other things I'm always saying to leaders is, if the problem can be solved with money, do it, because it is
Yeah.
the fastest, easiest way to solve a problem. The
Yeah.
problem is we write too many checks hoping it solves an issue that can't be solved with money.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people say this is more of like a personal finance commentary, but a lot of people say, like, if you have a problem that can be solved with money, it's not a problem. The real problems are the ones that can't be solved with money.
I
And
agree.
and
And I
what I
think,
really
yeah,
like is like this idea of your incentive plan, or maybe this is like an off incentive plan thing, but just like the value of creativity. Like, the right answers don't have to live in a spreadsheet,
I
they don't have
agree.
to be so dry and quantitative. I mean, just thinking creatively about, like, how can I just like pleasantly delight the people who are working hard for me? I mean, simple observation like that, I think, is extremely powerful.
It is. And you might be surprised to hear this from a person who spent her career in HR. It also can be individual and personalized. And of course, don't get me wrong, we have to be fair, we have to not discriminate. And unfortunately, most people who end up in lawsuits over that stuff, it wasn't their intention to discriminate, right? It was an unintended consequence.
Yeah.
But we've lost sight. We become scared about thinking about what matters to this person. I remember coaching a leader who was in a small business and worked in a place where a lot of the jobs came from larger businesses. Like the salary was just, it was impossible to match. But I said, what if we just started asking people, what would you want? And we crafted some really interesting recruitment packages against these bigger organizations. I remember one in particular was, there was this person who wanted to write a book. The president, I said, let's ask them if they'd take this salary for 4 days a week, and they could use the office space 1 day a week, to focus on writing their book. And and the president loved it, the person loved it. It was a creative solution to a problem that existed, which is getting this high caliber talent and not being able to match the salaries elsewhere and understanding what mattered to that person. And
Yeah.
again, I'm going to lose my HR card if I don't say, be careful about this stuff and make sure you're within the bounds of what's legal and non-discriminatory. But I think there's a lot to be said about understanding who's working for us and what motivates them and being creative.
So back to the challenges, and this challenge is going to really resonate, I suspect, with a lot of the new CEOs listening to
Yeah.
this. And that is how to handle inherited employees, so people that you
Yep.
didn't personally hire, whose salaries are just kind of all over the place. They fall outside of company-wide pay bands if the company has pay bands at all. So in my own experience, which I think is quite representative of the experience of most folks listening to this, I acquired my company. And when I looked at the compensation, like the best way that I can describe it was just kind of all over the place. No systems, no pay bands, just kind of the accumulated effect of 20 years worth of decisions made kind of from the gut of the founder. So that meant compensation between people, compensation across departments, like didn't make sense. There was no rhyme or reason. So, of course, as a new leader, I could change the incentive comp system, but changing salaries is like a whole other ballgame. And that's a really hard challenge for new CEOs who effectively like inherit a group of employees.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it happens more times than not, honestly. And it again, it doesn't happen out of some bad place. It just kind of happens over time.
Yeah.
So when it comes to base salaries, I think one of the important things is going back to your comment earlier on the incentive plan. This is the place where I don't believe in taking money away from people, even in the
Yeah.
case of demotion, believe it or not. But I think what we need to do is not make it worse year upon year. And so if you have a program whereby there's sort of everyone gets the same increase, it just furthers that challenge. So one of the things that I encourage leaders to do is, okay, we're going to take what we have now. We're going to make sure we have a solid foundation, which does include making sure that there's some appropriate salary bands. And then we're going to communicate with people that once a year, there may be some minimum amount that everybody gets. That's kind of the baseline. And then within the budget that we have, we're going to reward, based on things such as proficiency or maybe performance, although I'm not a huge fan of that. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at where people are within the range, and people who are farther away from the midpoint or what we would call the market rate are going to get a larger increase, and people who are above or over are going to get a smaller increase, maybe nothing, just the minimum. And so let's say you had a 5% budget to work with, maybe 2% was the amount that everybody got. But of the remaining 3% of the overall company budget, an individual may get anywhere from an additional 0% all the way up to 6 or 7 or 8% on top of that baseline 2%. And over time, that will begin to bring things in line. And more importantly, employees need to understand what's happening and why it's happening. And again, you're not going to have everybody love it. That's not our goal, but we want people to understand why it exists that way.
Yeah. What about, so I remember I think it was either every November, every December, I had to make these decisions where I had to allocate company-wide salary increases across the various internal departments. So we'd run our numbers and we'd say, okay, um, last year our salaries were $100. This year they can probably be $120. So I have to take that $20 and allocate it amongst the various groups. So we create a pool of money. We tried to allocate it. And inevitably, the allocation across the departments and between people was always tricky. And basically, everyone just always seemed to be disappointed with the results. Like, is that an inevitability? Or is there any way around that? Or is there some way to structure and systematize that in such a way where everyone doesn't, conclude that process with feelings of disappointment?
Yeah. This was a big project that I tackled at one of the organizations that I worked with to think about how to divvy up this salary budget. And one of the things I think we need to think about is some things are org wide. And that could be just the general change in cost of labor. That could be other priorities that are across the org. And then there's things that are specific to the departments. And that can include things like you may be hiring in employees within a certain department, and all those employees happen to be lower within the pay range. And so that department actually needs more of the budget than another department, which has got a lot of long tenured employees.
Yeah.
And so with this particular organization, we actually put the budget into 4 buckets. The first was a sort of annual increase that was allocated across the org in the same sort of percentage. The second was a sort of proficiency-based bucket that was based on how far away each of the average, we call it comp ratio. So the relationship of the salary to the midpoint. So if one department was at 89%, they would get a larger percentage. They would get the percentage of their salary budget they needed to kind of close more of that gap than, say, a department that was at 105% comp ratio. And then we had another small bucket that was used by the department leaders throughout the year for them to make one-off adjustments. And this could be from the person who came and said, I'm going to leave the organization unless, I get an increase, or maybe a person that was promoted from one role to another within the department. And then the last one was we had a bucket that we usually only used every 2 to 3 years, where we did an equity scan. And we looked for places where we felt like, from a combination of these various factors, it just left some gaps and equity concern among either departments or among individuals within a department. And so we started thinking about the salary budget on that, with that lens, and budgeting in those 4 kind of categories. So we made sure we were addressing different parts of what was happening in the org. And again, you might not be surprised to hear that part of my answer to people feeling like it's unfair is, if we did a job of explaining why each of these budget exists and how decisions are made, we didn't worry too much about whether people felt it was fair or not, because it felt like it was consistent with the strategic practices of the org.
Yeah. So we've gone through all of the ways that I managed to screw up my incentive comp plans. I'm curious if we've missed anything. Like, are there other challenges that leaders tend to encounter more often than not when trying to design an effective incentive compensation plan?
Yeah, I think I'd like to share a kind of a fun little story with an organization that I worked with. It was a tech organization, and they had a large portion of folks that worked on the front lines in their tech center. And they were hiring those employees at a pretty good salary coming right out of college. And they would give them the increases that would be, 3 to 5% every year. And what was happening was these employees were reaching that 2-year mark, and there was a large organization down the street, and their recruiters were sitting on LinkedIn. And about the 2-year mark, they were swooping in, and they were grabbing their talent, right? And the CFO and the HR called me in, and they're like, we got to fix this, And part of the issue was the wage was very appropriate when they brought in those folks entry level. But if you look at and you look at how does the wage increase by every year of experience? And generally for an entry level position in a knowledge-based industry, every 1 year of experience it makes that wage increase quite a bit. Let's call it 10%.
Yeah.
So I'm doing 4%, and the market's saying that person with 1 year experience from where they were is now worth 10% more. And by year 2, I've now given them another 4%. And there's another 10% in terms of the delta of their knowledge, right? Because now they're a person with 2 years of experience. They were doing a great job hiring them at the right rate, and they were given a pretty decent annual increase. But that org down the street was like, you just trained my workforce, and now I'm going to give them an increase. And the CFO is like, there's no way we can give every one of these employees, I think there were 60 of them, a 20% increase. And I said, how in the world, are you creating an organization where this larger organization is able to get these employees? And they're like, oh my goodness, we have the most amazing management team, and their training program they developed, they're able to get those folks up to speed within 4 weeks and get them on the phone supporting customers. And I looked at them and I go, I think you should double the pay of those folks, right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't quite double the pay, but what they decided to do was to figure out that what was going to work for them was to look within their organization and decide, where do I want to make the best talent investments that are going to pay off the best for me? Sometimes I see orgs trying to be all things to everybody within the org. And I am a big proponent of differentiation. Where do we need to invest more heavily in our talent to achieve our goals, and not to be afraid? And again, I'll lose my HR card again if I don't say you got to be careful about it in terms of individuals. But from a strategic standpoint, I always tell people, don't be afraid of differentiation. Uh, Fair is not, being the same with everyone is not fair, despite what
Yes.
many people think. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's an important thing to remember.
This was probably 3, 4 years ago. I interviewed Vern Harnish for this podcast. He's the founder of the Entrepreneurs Organization, and he wrote the book Scaling Up, and recently wrote a book, or maybe not recently anymore, called Scaling Up Compensation. It's all about compensation considerations for growing businesses. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, fairness, not sameness, which I think is exactly what you just said. Same isn't necessarily fair.
Agreed. Agreed. But do it by being thoughtful, and do it by being and don't be afraid, if you're going to do it, by being thoughtful, to explain it to people and own that decision. I
Yes.
think owning decisions is really important for entrepreneurs and CEOs.
Yes. Um, Stacey, last question for you, and it's the question that I always try to conclude with, time permitting, and that is, what is the most meaningful lesson that you've learned over the past 12 months across any domain of your life?
It's going to sound cliche, but it is really true. And that is, rest is productive. A
Hmm.
day without meetings or obligations is productive. And travel without cell phone reception is productive.
I love that. Did you go on a
I did.
vacation or a trip where you didn't have cell phone reception? You lived that
I
benefit
did.
firsthand?
I did. I went to Italy. I'm not afraid to say I celebrated my 50th birthday in Italy, and I did not have an international data plan. I, one person knew how to reach me via WhatsApp, and I stayed unplugged the entire trip. And I don't think I'll ever do it different. And it was scary, but again, I've been very open about my age. I remember thinking, we did exist in a world without cell phones, and we did
That's
go on
right.
vacation, and I think we still can.
That's right. I love that. I love that. I think everyone would do themselves a great service to remember that. Stacey, what a treat it was to speak with you. I wish I spoke to you 14 years ago when I put my first comp plan together, but hopefully this will help folks listening in the way that I wish that I was helped all those years ago. So we thank you for being generous with your time and your insights today.
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed it. I appreciate it.